So in my next video, I'm going to show you how I made these, and what these are wooden copies of this, which is a metal machinist vise that is not mine. I borrowed it for this video, but it's usually used with a drill press, and the throat of it is pretty small. The jaw opening is not very large, and it's also not scale what I'm used to working with. So I copied this, I copied all the dimensions and blew them up. These are about twice as big, but a little wider than twice as big as this one. And I made two versions. I made a plywood version and then a nicer hardwood version. They both work really well. They didn't cost me anything because I had all the materials in my shop. But if you had to buy stuff, you could easily make this, I think, for under 50 bucks. And I've already started editing the videos, and they're longer than I thought they would be. So I'm going to post one video of making the plywood version and one video of making the hardwood version. And if you want to learn how to make this, you don't have to watch both of them. The plywood version has a little more information. The making of them is a little bit different, but I don't think different enough that you'd have to watch both of them. The other reason I wanted to use this, besides using on the drill press, which is nice because with the long handles you could hold this firmly while you're drilling into it, but also because I've been doing a lot of carving lately and I wanted something that could hold oblong shapes and the odd shapes I've been working with for power carving. So the plywood I had laying around to start this project was some cabinet grade birch veneer ply. I only had 1/2 inch, which means I needed a lot more layers in order to get my thickness, which was 3 inches. So I needed 6 layers, and I wanted it to be about 12 inches by 5 inches at the end. So this was a little over 5 inches wide, and I cut the pieces to 13 inches long so that I had some wiggle room once glue up was done. Glued everything together, let it set up overnight. And then I saw someone on YouTube using a paint scraper to remove glue before sending it through your tools, and this works really well. It takes off all the big nubs, and then I just used my cross-cut sled to cut off the edges. I cut it down to size at this point, which was 12 inches wide, so I had nice square ends, and then with those square ends I could then just cut off the edges. And the beginning plywood I had to work with was only a little over 5 inches wide, so that's why I'm taking such small passes off the edge. My final dimensions on this ended up being exactly 12 by a little less than 5. So now what I'm going to start doing is just chopping this up to get all of these grooves in here. And this is the downside of this design, is I have to take out quite a bit of material from the middle. I don't have a super great way to do that. So I went through and made my initial marks. This back piece on the original is about 1 inch. So doubling it, I'm coming in 2 inches. This front piece here is 7/8. So doubling it, I have 1 7/8, but that should be 1 3/4. So all this has to come out. And then on the original, the opening comes down exactly halfway. So on mine, since this is 3, I'm coming down 1.5 inches. So all this has to come out. So the space I had to remove was about 8 inches and 1/4 wide. So what I did was I just put like an inch dado stack in my dado blade, in my table saw, and then I just started grooving this out, and I did it in multiple passes because you can't remove too much with a dado stack. If you had a reliable bandsaw, you could cut it out that way. This actually wasn't that bad. So next is going to be cutting these series of grooves in the bottom of the piece, but it goes through the whole length. I'm going to take this apart later in the video so you can see exactly how this works, but essentially that is pretty much the magic to how the jaws work, these 2 grooves. So on the original, this opening is 1 1/8 inches, this opening is 3/4, this comes up 5/8, this comes up 3/4, and that gives you a total depth here of 1 3/8 inches. And if you remember from this one, this is 1 1/4 inches. So this groove is 1/8 of an inch deeper than the thickness of the bottom here. So I started by marking center on my piece, and this is a little less than 5 feet wide. So my center ended up being like 2 7/8. And then I marked up, this is 1.5 inches, so I did 1/8 of an inch over that. So this coming up is 1 5/8 inches. So then on the original, the bottom groove is a little bit thicker than the top groove. So on mine, I made this 7/8 of an inch, and this one is 3/4 of an inch. This opening is bigger than this opening by 3/8 of an inch, and since I'm multiplying everything, I made my bottom opening bigger by 3/4 of an inch. So I just simply added 3/8 of an inch to either side of this, and now this is 3/4 inch wider than this top part. So now all of this has to come out all the way through. So I was going to cut this in multiple passes as well, and I have my 3/4 inch stack in there because the first cuts I'm going to make are that center column, and since it's 1.5 inches, if you line up that dado blade perfectly off center from your center line, you could flip it around and it will make a mirror cut on the other side of that line and center this groove perfectly. So once I had it lined up, you could see I'm adjusting the fence to now cut the 2 edges. I could flip it and cut them higher, and everything stays center without moving my fence. And then that's the groove I ended up with. This is not my first time taking this vise apart, but I noticed a couple things when I originally took it apart, and I want to point that out. So number one, this jaw has 2 pieces, which is held in place with these 2 screws. So that piece with the jaws is perfectly flush with the bottom edge of this groove. So that is going to be an important measurement, but this piece that holds everything in place is not the same size as this groove because you don't want it to bind on the edges. So that's kind of nice. This piece doesn't have to have a super tight tolerance. So you can see how those 2 pieces fit in place. So then this jaw, which is the movable part of the piece, is in here with the threaded rod. And this threaded rod has a notch in it, right in the middle. So it sits, this just sits down in there. You can see it's one piece, just sits down in here. When you flip it on its edge, it has a little hole, which is what goes in there. And this is why you have 2 different size screws. This screw goes in the back hole and will line up with that groove. So when this is all in place, you could still spin this guy, but you won't be able to take this, the jaws in and out. So for the rest of today, what I'm going to do is glue up a block of wood in order to make this movable jaw. So this process was the same as gluing up the original base, and I ended up with a piece that was like 5 inches by 3 inches tall. So once again, I think it was, or maybe it was a little bit shorter than that. So I think I cut 6 pieces, but only ended up using 5. Yeah, that looks like a 5-inch chunk. And I kind of clamped this together off camera, let this dry overnight. So it's the next day, and this cabinet grade plywood is definitely nicer than the cheaper plywood, but it's not as nice as Baltic birch, and as luck would have it, I have a huge knot right on my slides. So I was planning on doing this originally, but I'm definitely going to do it now, and I have some scraps of Teflon left over from a project I did from someone a few months ago. Now this you can get to stick to your project with some very strong spray adhesive, if and only if your Teflon is etched. So when you order this, you want to make sure you order etched Teflon. It'll have this brown appearance on the back. Like I said, I already had this stuff, and I believe I definitely have enough to at least do the slides, and I would also like to do this inner portion right here, and if that's covered with Teflon, then the plywood block I put in there should slide easily without having to put Teflon on that as well. Now this stuff isn't super expensive, but it's also not cheap. If you want to get it, I know McMaster-Carr sells it. That's where I got this stuff from, and it will say adhesive ready sheets. and I believe this was a 30-second. So you could see that there for 6x6 it's like $10, 6x12 it's like 20, and if you're only making one, you could probably get this 6x12 and be able to do all your parts. So like I said, not super expensive, not beyond cheap. Any sort of plastic really could probably work as well, but like I said, I had this, so I'm going to use it. So this Teflon's really easy to work with. I basically just made some marks on the scraps. You could cut it with a razor blade, it fits into place nicely. And then I have some high strength number 90 3M spray adhesive. You put it in place, apply a little pressure, and it's permanently attached. It's hard to see because I did it off camera, but you could also shave it with a chisel. It shaves right off. At least the thin stuff that I have does. So then with that done, I went and started sizing up that top piece by trimming off all the glue, just like the base, and cutting it to width, which ended up being the same width as the base, which is a little under 5 inches. Then I went through and made marks with my square for where the groove is, as well as the depth of the groove, and I cut that out with my cross-cut sled because that will keep everything nice and square, a bunch of curves, and then I could clean it up. So I'm left with a little nub that fits into the groove. So here's that finished piece, and you can see it pretty much lined up with where my lines were. But I got it close, and then I just kept kind of creeping up on it, taking off very small cuts at a time. You don't want any play in this. As you can see now, this fits in there snugly without any play and slides really nicely. If you flip it over to the bottom, it's flush. You can tell just by your finger that that's flush. So I think this is good for now. I might have to tweak it a little bit, but I think it's going to work as is. So what I'm going to do now is just trim this down so it's all the same size. So I had a 5/8 inch threaded rod that goes through a 5/8 inch coupling in my shop. The coupling is 1 inch in diameter. So in order to start this process, I drilled a shallow inch hole because that is what's going to be in the stationary jaw, but I needed a 5/8 inch hole going down through the stationary hole into the movable jaw. So I drilled all the way through with that 5/8 inch hole, and I just marked that movable jaw. I could drill it later as long as it was lined up using this end boring jig. Then once I had that, I could come back through, remove the movable jaw and drill and finish drilling that 1 inch hole for the coupling to fit in. You could see now that I have it apart, I was able to finish drilling that 5/8 inch hole to the depth I needed, and then I kind of gauged how long my threaded rod needed to be, and I cut that down to size. So I'm using a scrap piece of oak as the bottom section of this vise, and you can see I have it shimmed in place because it doesn't have to sit flush against those two side rails. So with that shimmed in place, I came in about 3/4 inch from the edge, and I drilled 1/4 inch holes through that oak and then into my movable jaw. That front hole is going to be where the longer screw is going to go through. The back hole is going to be just holding everything in place. Now I'm using T-nuts in order to attach everything. So the T-nuts were 5/16. So then I went through, once I had that 1/4 inch hole, and widened them with the 5/16 bit. So then in order for those T-nuts to set flush with the bottom of my plywood base, I'm using a 3/4 inch bit to counter bore a shallow groove so that the face of that nut sits flush. I could hammer those into place and start test fitting everything. So a shorter screw goes in the back, and then the longer screw that's going to have to be tapered to connect to the threaded rod will go in the front. So you could see once I put everything in place and put those screws in the hole, you could see that screw comes up through the center of my hole. So then I used a paintbrush with a little bit of paint on it with that threaded rod in place to mark where I needed to cut that groove. Just to recap, I've been fine-tuning all my pieces because you're going to have to play with reforming some of the threads after you cut all these things. So for my oak block, I have one with the threaded insert and then the regular hole, And then for my plywood, I ended up putting threaded inserts in 2. So this is what my threaded rod ended up looking like. And I had to take a file and reform these threads down here in order for it to work in my coupling. And then this is that screw. I ended up taking that to a pretty good point, just because with the disc on my angle grinder, you could see it creates it more of an arc than a square bottom cut there. So in order for this to fit into place, I had to keep it pretty pointed. And then to avoid having to take this in and out a million times, I started using washers as spacers so I could get the exact right depth going through my piece. By adding or removing washers, it's a lot easier than to keep grinding at this and grinding at this. I think mine's going to work with 2 washers, which ended up working out nicely because this bolt has a groove for a countersunk hole, so now it fits pretty flush in these washers. So there was some playing around getting all these pieces to work and getting the right measurements, and at some point I did realize I didn't need that T-bolt in the oak as well, but I just kept it in there. I'm about to see how well this clamps pieces in place, but so far I'm pretty happy with it. The shaft moves the whole distance right now without binding. This is really snug. There's absolutely no play in it whatsoever. Really the only mistake that I'll have to fix is the fact that these stick below the base, which is either going to be a matter of countersinking these in place or making this oak smaller. I swapped out this original piece of oak with this scrap piece of cherry I had laying around. This is actually a cutoff from the other vise I'm making, and I just used this one as a jig to cut the new hole so everything lines up perfectly. And now my clearance is below the bottom of the vise. I also had to shorten, where is it? I also had to shorten my screw even a little bit more for it to work, but I already tested it and this does work. So what I'm going to do now is glue in all of my T-nuts with some epoxy so they don't come out, as well as glue in my coupling. So I use T-nuts for this because I have a ton of them, because they are used commonly in jigs, but you can't really buy one of them. So I just have bags of these T-nuts laying around. So they do have a tendency to pull out of whatever you're putting them in, especially if something is being torqued against it, which would be in this vise. So epoxy them in place is kind of your best bet. You can use threaded inserts, but I prefer T-nuts over threaded inserts. So then to finish this up, I wanted to add a handle to the end of that threaded rod just to make it easier to turn. I had some scraps laying around that kind of were handle shaped, and I drilled a 5/8 inch hole in the back of it and then just epoxied that into my threaded rod. I ended up using the metal vise that I was copying in order to hold everything in place. So then through the end of it, I'm adding a 1/4 inch carriage bolt. I cut off the head of the carriage bolt, and I have been practicing on my lathe, so I kind of had some beads laying around, some maple beads. I cut all those beads into pieces, drilled some holes in them, and then could attach them to that 1/4 inch bolt. Now I have a nice crank with some leverage at the back side of my vise. For the removable jaws, so that you don't mar up your vise, I just used some scrap oak I had laying around, drilled some holes through them, countersunk them, and then attached them, sanded everything, and then this was pretty much ready to go. I put a coat of general finishes on everything except for the Teflon, obviously, and I think I did 3 coats on the plywood. One thing I had been thinking about was putting grooves on the removable jaw pieces in order to better grip things, but I think that's going to be something I'll add if I need it. All my finished pieces, I ended up putting only about 1 coat of finish on any part that's going to touch sliding parts, because you don't want the finish to build up. In fact, this one was a hair loose, and because I put a layer of finish on the inside and a layer of finish on that, this one's actually quite snug now. I didn't have that problem on this one because I didn't coat the Teflon. So this morning I went through and I put wax on all my sliding parts, and I'll probably reapply that wax as time goes by, but now everything moves really nicely in these two. And I let them set up for a couple days just because if you put them together too soon the finish will stick. But I have a coat of wax on all the touching parts, so I think I should be fine. And now I'm going to just reassemble these and see if they can hold things. So the nice thing about the plywood one is the plywood one works very smoothly because it's not going to have to follow the same sort of principles as hardwood as far as expansion and contraction with humidity. Now this is in the middle of the summer, so everything will be the most humid now, so if anything it will shrink, but the plywood you won't really have that problem. You can see it just moves very nicely. And I tested it out with some wood in place and you can't pull it out, and that's basically all I could ask for with these. You can see these are the finished pieces. The one thing I might do down the line is in the rails, I might countersink some holes so that I could screw these vices to a table and be able to really work on stuff without worrying about them moving.